on planning in Boston. At the end, I'll throw a few comments in about Detroit, Michigan as well, a place close to my heart. And then we'll just we'll have a chance to kibitz a little bit and talk about things. So what I'm going to do is I've got 3 basic notes to share. The first of all, am I in a way that's visible to all the other viewers who might be tuning in from the outside? Great. And then everybody can hear me. Great. So there are 3 basic things I wanted to talk about today. One is something from our charter at the BPDA, formerly the BRA, blight, decadence, and substandard housing. Second, I wanted to talk about 800,000 people. And the third topic, I wanted to address a sort of a new partnership and the ways that we are thinking about our partnership with the development industry in our community so that we can continue to make progress here in the city. So the first topic has to do with blight, decadence, and substandard housing. Those are the 3 words that are at the center of our charter as the BPDA. So for those who don't know, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the BPDA's origins. In 1957 through 1960, there was a dialogue in our city about the fact that the city was finding itself unable to grow. It was finding itself unable to attract and retain new business. And it was experiencing a very significant downturn in population. You can see that our peak population in 1950, and then in 1980, we had our low, but that the downturn sort of started in the 50s and 60s. It's a combination of quote white flight and other kinds of decline. The more recent history is that of resurgence, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. But our city's basic business proposition was really in question in 1960. Obviously, the prospect of living and working in a city is that you have that competitive advantage cities always offer, the density of services, labor, and industry in close proximity. You can see from one of my favorite old pictures of Jordan Marsh to sort of what the city was becoming. And unfortunately, this kind of pattern of pictures is something I got very familiar with in Detroit, to tell you about later. But even the Globe kind of agreed that the city was becoming a backwater and a tumble-down has-been as a city. At the same time, there were themes, I'm sure you're hearing about this in all your coursework, about the way that cities should grow. A very car-focused approach to bringing cities back. Obviously, if anyone's read The Power Broker, hopefully everyone has, the lead that Robert Moses was bringing to the way that cities were going to come back. And we also know that we got one of our own leaders like that in our city, Ed Logue, who became the director of was then the BRA. So in 1957, with all these themes emerging, of course, this is the 1990s and 2000 version of the logo, but for those of you who are logo fanatics like me, what you'll know is that the view of the city at that time was we need to create basically a publicly chartered business enterprise whose job is to take and use urban renewal resources and powers to create a new look and feel in the city, everything from work on highways to clearance of entire neighborhoods like the West End, and then the replacement of those things with sort of the buildings and architecture of that time. You can see, from the West End Urban Renewal Plan to the work we were doing in Prudential Center. There was a time that the BPDA owned almost a third of the land between us and the rights of way associated with roadways. We almost owned a third of the land in the city. It's hard to imagine that when you think about how small a city this is. But principally, the idea of the agency was to push the city forward with a little bit of, again, a public enterprise. I'm referencing public enterprises specifically for a specific reason, because that often the city might need an agent who kind of advances things a little bit faster than the body politic generally might be ready to accept. And that was exactly what was chartered when the BPDA started, or was then the BRA started. Now, of course, there were other moves afoot, which I know you hear about thematically from Jane Jacobs and other places, but here in Boston, citizens responded in particular to places like Roxbury and Jamaica Plain, where people said, you know, we don't actually want you to do the things you're doing. We're going to fight. So born out of that was a much different, the clash of those two themes was a much different city. And we have the luxury of having, you have the luxury of having some of the leaders of that city in the room with you today and teaching some of the classes that you go to. Boston has grown sort of through that conflict into a national powerhouse. It has to do with our combination of medical and educational institutions and the way that those institutions foster and drive the growth of the city. You know, you can basically look at any economic statistic and the work being done all over the city and see that that the détente that came out of that clash has led to an enormous amount of growth. Look at places like Longwood, downtown Boston, obviously more recently the Seaport. And you can see that the combination of Boston's strong labor force, its population, the quality of life and neighborhoods has made it into one of the most desirable places in the city. You know, there's pictures, I think a couple pictures of Seaport here as well. And you can see that we're going to get more. The cranes are in the air and we're continuing to grow. So that's great. Full stop. It's great to be where we are. There are some threats, however, and those threats are not that different in some ways than the threats that the city faced in 1960 and 1957. So, you know, there's climate change. There's the mayor on Morrissey Boulevard, not far from my place in Dorchester. Climate change and the need to adapt to it in ways that are baked into the way we grow is an essential. It's not that different than blight might have been back in 1950. If we don't adapt to this, then we're going to lose a lot. Now, we have had the benefit in our city of having great planning leaders and others who've been focused on the capacities of the waterfront to bring the city together and the ways that waterfront development can drive. I will tell you I had actually, while friends of mine were doing that kind of work here and other places, I had a chance to do some of that work at the federal level. And I can tell you there's nothing like calling a mayor to talk about their community and when they're going to get resources to build, not FEMA, because FEMA's there first, but HUD comes later. Having those conversations about how much money they get and what to do with it. You're sitting in your brutalist building and the Weaver building in Washington, D.C., and they're sitting in a building that's full of mold and people coming in and out talking about when they're going to be able to take a tarp off their roof. That's a very, very real experience for me. And so I say that's just a little part of the experience that people who lead those cities have. And so while we talk about waterfront development and planning in one way 10, 15 years ago, today, it's really much more of a hybrid of how do we make this waterfront amazing and how do we protect our city from the changes that climate change adaptation has for us. Another picture illustrating the same problem. We also have a problem of affordability. All those trends that has made us strong in the last 50 years have begun to make us a little bit weak too. Our workforce is having to find places to live and work that are just outside the city because the city is so expensive. What are the structural ways of addressing this? You know, we've also got people who can't afford to live in the city who may have just begun to be able to afford to live in the city. And this is I got in a lot of arguments about this with some of my friends and colleagues. These are maps. Obviously, those of you who know color of law know the impact that these maps have had on where different kinds of people can live in Boston. And you know, when you juxtapose this with the fact that, sorry, go back a little bit. When you juxtapose this, people moving out and finding their way to Brockton where they can have a affordable experience of homeownership, when they were structurally pushed out of parts of Boston or part of the experiment of Beburg that didn't particularly go well, you realize that there's equity work that our city needs to do as well to make sure that people who have been here have a chance to have their stakes in the city grow, and that we are structurally making it possible for people to stay in Boston. So this is an image that one of my colleagues, Diana, Fernandez developed, which is meant to sort of begin to ask people the question about what is it about our landscape that makes people feel like they belong, because that's what we need to build. The same way you see all the brutalist buildings of the early BRA, what is the landscape that makes people from every part of Boston feel included and reflected? So at any rate, what I wanted to do was just to close out blight, decadence, and substandard housing was to say, I think our view is that equity, affordability, and resilience are the three things that we're focused on delivering. And as we think about how to change the agency into what it needs to be in the future, it's those three existential threats to the city that we're focused on, using the authorities and powers of the agency to begin to attack those issues. I can talk in more detail during the Q&A about what that looks like for resilience to be a real focus, and how urban renewal powers and eminent domain can be part of making resilience happen at scale in the city of Boston. So the next piece I want to talk about is 800,000 Bostonians. So you saw the population data. The mayor has become very interested in talking about 800,000 Bostonians because we haven't been 800,000 people since in the post-civil rights era. And so what would Boston look like and feel like as an 800,000 person city? So what we began to do was sort of dive into the Western European and American cities that are 800,000 people and just do a little cross section. What is different about the way those places are working, or what are the things they've achieved that we should be focused on? So in Seattle, and again, I'm going to ask David if I'm right, but it seems like there's been a negotiation that's resulted in kind of a broad public negotiations resulted in a greater acceptance of height in the development of buildings, in particular in neighborhoods, and what we've been able to achieve here in Boston, and to allow some of that work to happen as of right. It's another lesson that we've taken from the places that have grown to 800,000. Another slide that I want to share with you before we get into the relationship with the water is San Francisco. San Francisco is now beginning to look at using ADUs or accessory dwelling units to create a little more gentle density in their community, something that we're very focused on here in a few neighborhoods that are going, like Mattapan and a few others where there's a little room for more gentle density to come to the fore. Another area that we're focused is places that have grown have been able to find a relationship with water. I mean, obviously, those who focus on this, the experience in the Netherlands and their relationship with water is one that we've been keeping a close eye on. Rebuild by Design, the HUD program that funded a number of new technology, new projects that sort of experimented with ways to address this issue, have been quite interesting. This is Kate Orff's project in New York City that came out of Sandy, where they're using a combination of oyster beds and seawall to create a very different outcome, hopefully, for the next storm there. And then transportation, identifying ways to attack the transportation issue that aren't tied to outside entities. One of the challenges we've had, those of you who live in the city know that the Orange Line's shutdown really had a huge impact on the way we think about the reliability of our public transit. Public transit's frankly something so critical to us that the loss of it really made us explore, are there ways that we can, there's a thing in when you're working on a development agreement or contract where there's one of the things at the end, we call them representations and warranties, that say you have to use self-help in order to make sure that the contract intent gets met. We began to say, well, if we can't control the train and we're going to work collaboratively with the people who operate it, but we also need to explore self-help. Are the things we need to be doing with our rights of way, our roadways, road diets that are going to help us but more quickly achieve that? And this is not a remote issue, it's abstract. I have a neighborhood that I work closely with in Charlestown, where we have a neighborhood plan going on. There's 10 million square feet of development available that's been proposed to the city for that neighborhood. But without the train not only being where it was a few years ago or getting better, we really can't invite that kind of growth in the city. And those of you who know the way the economics of Boston function, 70% property tax, subject to a 2.5% cap in expenditure every year. if we don't grow the size of that pie every year, we can't be the Boston that you know. So obtaining that growth isn't just sort of like, we'd like to have bike lanes, we'd like to have shuttle services, we can't have development that's before us take place unless we're able to find a way to invite more people to work in the city and travel to the city in non-motorized ways. So this is a little bit of a taste of what we know we're going to have to take on if we're going to become an 800,000 person city. Relationship with height, relationship with the water, and relation specifically through climate change's effect on that, and then finally our relationship with transportation and the ways that we pursue it. So I think this calls for a bit of a new partnership. We have had a particular partnership with development historically where the mayor does certain things, BPA director and staff do different things. I think we're planning to and looking at ways that we can sort of strengthen and change our relationship with the development business. Specifically, I think we like to highlight places where some of it's already happening. Here at Harvard, we had a great success working in partnership with Tishman Speyer and Harvard University in the plan to expand their enterprise research campus. One of the reasons I focus on that is because while that's one of the places where a new threshold for what we call inclusionary development program units was established. The current threshold is 13%. Harvard almost doubled the amount of IDP units. An inclusionary development program unit is a unit that has a deed restriction, meaning it has to be leased for usually less than 70% area median income. So the ability to achieve a higher ratio there is an indication and a sort of stepping forward by the university and Tishman in particular to say we're going to commit more because that's what's going to be needed. I think that the balance here is that, whoops, I'm almost slide ahead. The balance here is that while we know we're going to need more, the threats of affordability to our workforce are really significant. We're going to need more capital to make it possible for us to have the affordable housing that we need. Frankly, we need people in our city to provide the workforce that's going to keep us strong and performing the way we have. Recognizing that we're going to need more from our development partners, we've got to evaluate how we're going to make their work more efficient and better organized around our three existential challenges, again, affordability, resilience, and equity. So Harvard was an example of us taking a few of those things to heart and having it happen in real time. The last thing I would just say to this audience in particular, because I know I'm speaking to young people and students in a place that I was once a young person and a student, I thought it would be material to talk a little bit about Detroit. So I've had the luxury, the great development in my career to have a chance to serve in a number of in the public sector, in a number of moments of transition and moments of change. When I worked in 2000 in the District of Columbia, which had a control board, I got a chance to work on the site selection process for a new ballpark, which is now Nationals Ballpark, and the redevelopment of an old convention center, which is now City Center DC. Both those things are doing great things for the city of Washington, DC, or the District of Columbia. I also had the chance to work in Detroit at the time that the bankruptcy began, and then 8 years later, leave to go join the federal government. What I'd highlight there is in both those situations and the one I'm in now, working in the public sector and trying to lead change is a lot of fun. And wherever you can find it, and importantly, I had the luxury of working with great leaders in both those places, from whom I learned an enormous amount. But I think those places can be a real crucible for that kind of work. Boston's a different kind of crucible. It's a strong market. It's already a strong market. Washington and Detroit needed to find ways to become stronger. But the chance to learn about the sort of nuts and bolts of what makes good city policy from national leaders was a real opportunity for me. And I guess I would encourage each of you, as you are thinking about places to go and things to do, I know you have chances to develop that app that's going to do something astonishing in a specific zone, or you'll have a chance to work in the private sector and do that development that's going to, especially in the moment that we're in the United States, the role that you will play in bringing people together and developing consensus around development, making sure that that social contract and that development agenda are as close to one another as they can be. That's crucial work. And I would ask you all to think about doing it. So if you like that part, I would also ask you all to think about doing it with us, because we have a number of positions open and are always looking for smart, hardworking people who want to put it on the line. So those are my comments. I think I've left plenty of room for Q&A, and I appreciate your time and attention, especially and of course the people in the listeners and the broader audience. Again, appreciate you too.
Great. We can just stand, or maybe we can grab a seat. We'll open it up for audience Q&A in a second. So I just wanted to first lead us off with a question. Since this speaker series also involves the topic of urban science, it's a new area of research for DUSP and MIT in general. We actually have a new joint degree between the computer science department and the urban planning department, urban studies and planning department, that has been in place for a couple of years with the undergraduates, not yet a graduate program. But I wanted to seek your thoughts on what do you think in these three priority areas that you outlined for the city currently: resilience, affordability, and equity. What sort of research would you like to come out of academic institutions like MIT and DUSP? Where do you think that the academic planning community could support what is really timely and important for cities right now, like Boston?
I would say that I did note the change. Is it the urban science department, or is it still urban studies?
The department is still the same. We just have a new degree for the undergraduates.
So when I read that, I immediately thought about some of the work that I'd seen Sidewalk Labs try to do in Toronto, and also that they were talking about beginning in Detroit. And I thought about that because the science of it, even picking the categories and things to study is fascinating. And I thought, I've just never thought about it quite like that. But I think the science that would be interesting to me would be, just off the top of my head, I would say, one thing I've noticed in my travels is that in Western Europe in particular, the thinking about housing is much more part of the, instead of thinking about housing and healthcare, for example, as being extremely distinct things that have nothing to do with one another, the relationship between housing and healthcare is sort of assumed. And it seems like when people think about the sort of category in which you fund different activities, they think about housing kind of alongside healthcare as one of those things that people kind of entitled to, and that the government has to act accordingly to make it happen. So understanding the relationship between the status of people's housing in the United States and the status of their health and the relationship in between those two things would be very valuable. I think it would help us make an argument about why, in particular, housing is so important. A couple of other things. I have found all of the sort of a weight joiner to things like Lyft and Uber and ride hailing and use of cabs. I was sort of a weight adopter to that. But now I find it really fascinating how much information those companies must have about user behavior and transportation trends. And so understanding people's need for transit in a different data-driven way than maybe we've been able to understand it before. How many people get on and off a train, and that's very much something we've been able to know, but like the way people are using other forms of transportation, last mile transportation, I think that's data that would be really valuable for us to know in building sort of city of the future. I'm tempted to name something that's more connected to resilience, but I don't quite know what to say there yet, other than there's been enough rebuilding efforts as a result of storm impacts. I'd love to sort of hear and learn more about what strategies cities have used that have been most effective in protecting them in the future. I mean, I feel like when you look at what they've done in Holland or other places, you say, that's great, but there's such long lead projects that require so many billions of dollars that sort of making smart decisions about what the future holds and where to protect and where not to protect, super valuable and be very valuable to me in my job. I mean, I think we know where water will inundate the city when sea level rise happens. So we can have a plan to protect those things, but I feel like there is a dynamic to the way climate change works that you can't quite be predicted as well. So any kind of modeling that would help us better understand that would be valuable to me.
Right. So maybe just to piggyback on that last point about resiliency, and also to connect this back to transportation and city design. Boston recently went through a citywide master planning effort over a very, very long gap in between. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what we may be anticipating or hoping in terms of how this extra population, the 800,000 limit, will affect the form of Boston, the urban form of Boston. And I think it's connected to resiliency in a way that, for instance, we've already been seeing significant density growth around some of the major transit hubs, like North Station, with Fenway currently being very rapidly growing and densifying, with Dot Ave, with Broadway in South Boston, et cetera. And so, transportation is oftentimes the leading source of emissions in cities, like over a third of all emissions. And so what do you think we ought to be thinking about or anticipating as we go forward with this new vision for Boston in terms of where will spatially that extra population reside, and then what sort of urban form do we aspire towards?
So I think there's a very easy answer to me, which is the places that are, I think, appropriate to grow are sort of squares and corridors that are best served by public transit. So a Fields Corner, a Maverick Square, these are places that we think that more density is possible, and where more density is possible, more density is probably warranted and appropriate. The challenge will be Boston, as they talk about a lot in Kairos' real estate class, has a very kind of bespoke system of, well, it's actually very simple. In fact, it's sort of everything's sort of zoned down to a lot of minimums. A real product of like a political process of rezoning in the 1990s. But as a result, each upzoning or each move to change really requires developers to have incredible amount of stamina, financially and otherwise, and really create a kind of a bespoke environment around a specific place that allows them to have the chance to develop a plan and get it approved that has the level of sort of scale that it needs to have. So I think your question was, I see it in the squares, corridors, and corners of the city, where you have first floor commercial uses, you have they're sort of already meeting places for other people going to trains or going to get different kinds of services, or just see each other and go eat or drink. Those are the places that we have the chance to grow. There may be some additional density that can be achieved through what I was describing as a more gentle form of density, with accessory dwelling units or sort of smaller increases in zoning, or as of right abilities to grow. But that's the general direction.
Yeah, and just very briefly related to that, I mean, Boston, like many other American cities, is also facing the issue that as we densify around transit, those new people who move into those areas are not necessarily transit riders. That there's oftentimes, real estate prices, especially downtown, extremely high. So people end up still having vehicles in transit served areas. And so the story of housing provision and transportation seems to be incredibly connected there in order to actually achieve those gains.
This is a major concern. I mean, the things you talked about just in that question, layers of them, new people, What new people are doing to different neighborhoods of the city that haven't had new people is remarkable. And it's going to be a major challenge for us, kind of just to get people to not use cars. I mean, but what's troubling about it and tough about it is that, you know, people make decisions about whether they would convert to using, a person who has a chance to convert to using a bicycle would make a decision about that on the basis of the network of bicycle, bicycle thoroughfares for them. So if it's broken, you know, maybe I don't do that. Maybe I just use my car. And it's going to be, I mean, unfortunately, we have I think fortunately for the city, sometimes these conversations are difficult. And fortunately for the city, we have our chief of streets, Yasha Franklin Hodge, who's really, really excellent. I think also a graduate of the program here. But he's really helping us kind of convene some of those tough conversations about changing to different modes, and how changing to different modes isn't, you know, there are tough decisions required, and everyone can't be convenienced.
Okay, let's open it up. First, we'll prioritize questions from the live audience here, and Ari has a mic to go around. So please do speak into the mic so that the audience online can also hear. Otherwise, they won't hear.
So I have one question. Yes. Keep going. Let's go with the questions. I'll ask you later.
Yeah. Justin?
Thank you very much for coming to present. I had a question more about your experience over the years in engaging with the staff at the BPDA, but also in your travels,
Sure.
Whether there is or is not a shift in culture that you might have observed, particularly with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think having more involvement of the federal government or even the state government in helping cities achieve these goals of resilience, equity, affordability. And maybe specifically, if you might comment on perceptions towards the potential repeal of fair cloth. I think that was in a House bill, but wasn't going to go through the Senate. But what does that mean for the city and how you think about planning in the future?
Astute question. So first, your professor behind you, Dave, was just talking to me about the how the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act had affected us. I could actually tell you more about Detroit maybe than I could tell you here. I mean, it has the potential to do very significant things. The availability of money to fund some of these activities that's federal is very exciting. I think the thing that's tough also about it is that it's transportation money. It takes a long time to be deployed. It's sort of a longer lead activity. So I think some places are just kind of getting up to speed about it. Other places are very ready for it. I do think it's changing. I would say that one of the, this is about a little more inside baseball, but one of the things I'd say about the way that the allocation of these funds and the way the negotiation is structured among people in the legislature, in the Congress, is that you get lots of slices of large amounts of money in very narrow bands, very targeted activities. And so a lot of the flexibility that you might want isn't always there. Obviously, you can work around that, but it's a big challenge. So I can just say that from the way the legislative process works, what I've found in my efforts to try to target dollars there have been lots of sort of bands of resources that are very targeted, that are kind of hard to, not easy and so easy to merge with others. But again, that's just early. And so then on fair cloth means different things to different places. For those who don't know what fair cloth means, fair cloth, I think, refers to an individual and an act that allows housing authorities, and you have the National Expert Housing Authorities here in the audience as well, so I don't want to get this wrong, but what it does is it allows housing authority to have a certain number of units in the sort of Section 9 program, which is traditionally funded public housing. So many cities, for different reasons, had a number. The number was set, I think, in the mid 90s, And well, you can never have more units than that, but many places have fewer. And so what they're doing is they're trying to use their fair cost eligibility to create more public housing. Now, one of the challenges there is that the operating dollar amount that you get to operate public housing is really way out of whack with the actual cost of operating public housing. So there's a capital allocation and an operating allocation. You can use them to do some cool things, especially with existing housing and preserved housing. We're experimenting with ways you could replace through, oh my God, RAD. You can, do different kinds of transactions where you can enhance the value of the operating subsidy. But I think it's a great thing. For example, in Detroit, we had many thousands of units that were under fair cost. So we had a chance to sort of expand public housing. We also had some capital to do so. In Boston, it's been much more carefully managed historically. So there's not quite as many opportunities, but I can tell you Kate's working hard to exploit them, or more accurately, to make the most of them.
Thank you. Any more questions?
It's a very stupid question, maybe mostly a curiosity because I'm not very familiar with system here. I was wondering about resources, because for addressing resilience, affordability, and equity, I was quite impressed also by the image that you showed about climate change, the effect of sea rising. How it works here, I mean, the main resources comes from the city, from the state, from the country, how it works in and how it should be, in your opinion. Yeah.
So you'll indulge me, I have a very particular perspective on this. Kind of speaking macro, we tend to think about resilience we have historically thought about resilience. Hopefully that's changing pursuant to your question, but we have historically thought about it as after a lack of resilience was shown, what is the response to it? So, the general breakout is insurance is supposed to cover private losses on stuff for people who are and to target places that can't necessarily be replaced with insurance. There's disaster recovery funds of various kinds. There's also FEMA, and there's also FEMA funds that help and fund some of the immediate response, and Corps of Engineers and others help build some of the other public infrastructure. It's really a system designed, at least from my perspective, it has been a system designed to respond to an event that's occurred. And so the real challenge is on the local community to sort of make a decision about how it's going to rebuild thoughtfully. And so what you saw with at the end of the Obama administration was a focus by HUD with its resources of recovery to focus on ways to use the money that it was giving to communities to sort of make those communities stronger and rebuild. I think there's an example from Hoboken that's been highlighted often about using seawalls to sort of as recreational and park assets, but also protecting areas that are low-lying. But to answer your question, I'd say it's a mix of things, but when the federal government is involved, or state government, usually federal government's involved first, state government to a lesser degree, it's all about recovering from a storm. And so the challenge to the community is how do they use their own local resources, sometimes state resources, to become more, to make a better decision about how to recover or rebuild. There's a lot of debate at the federal level about how to do this better. I think certainly in the current administration, there's a lot of ambition and thinking about change, but the system is still pretty designed around after events have taken place. It's also difficult in communities to go to someone and say, you have a very low level of capitalization. I want you to take on protecting your community. Well, I'd like to do that. Maybe I can't afford to do that and also do other things I need to do for people who are here now, who haven't been affected by a disaster. It's a very tough conversation, but I don't know if I think there's tougher ones, but it's a very tough conversation. See.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that at one point the VPDA owned almost a third of land in Boston.
Yeah.
How much land does the VPDA own now? And how do you think about the way you use that land now or the way that you will moving forward?
Sure. Don't know the answer to the first question in terms of percentage. Sorry about that. What we're doing now is we just performed a land audit recently that was designed to tell us every piece of land we owned, us along with the city. And what we're trying to do is the mantra is public land for public good. So we are trying to make that land available to, again, each piece of land is different, but where possible, if it's large enough, we're trying to make it available for affordable housing specifically, or commercial uses that'll help us fund affordable housing. We had the Winthrop garage that we sold for many hundreds of millions of dollars, and that money was spent on different public housing and other assets. I think public land for public good is the basic theme, but if it's not being used for affordable housing, it's usually being used as a community garden, some other kinds of local use. But we're very focused on it now. And I'd say the largest individual property we still own in the conventional way is parcel P3 in Roxbury across from Ruggles, where we have a large affordable for sale residential development and lab building proposed, and where there's been a organization that's been nominated to win the award. So working very closely on things like that. That's what I see. Nick, one of our leaders from Detroit on tax policy, who's here, one of your PhD candidates. How you doing? Up to you, man. Good to see you.
Hey, one sec, Nick. We'll take a question from online. So Rafael Sigal, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Thank you. Rafi Siegel. Yes.
Hi, Raphael. How are you?
Hey. Yes. Thanks. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. It's great to hear that Boston is growing and the BPDA is aware of that and on it. City government in general and city planning has been over the years increasing, strengthening, I would say, in a way, really establishing more involvement of communities in the permitting and approval processes, and giving more power to communities, which is a positive thing. But on the other hand, communities in general tend to be anti-growth, anti-development, and maybe they don't see the big picture. So my question is, how does the city, and especially planning, deal with that, with a situation where there is a need to grow and you have the big picture kind of in front of you, while more power is given to communities which are anti-growth?
It's a great question, very apropos of this conversation. So I like to answer this question with this personal anecdote. So I would say maybe midway through my time working in Detroit, we had completed a neighborhood plan, and we had a decision to make because we're encountering a lot of local, sort of a very riven neighborhood, half of which really wanted the development, the other half of which didn't. And so we had a decision to make, which was, and this is Detroit in a particular time, do we spend all of our political capital on getting this individual mixed income project to happen, which is well-designed, in the right place, had all the right features, or do we try to push for that project in the context of trying to create a zoning envelope for more projects that would happen after that project? And so we sort of began a negotiation or engagement with the community about doing both. And it became really clear that we had the ability to sustain the energy of the proponents for change was probably not strong enough to get past the individual project being approved, in part because the project was very tangible. At the end of the dialogue, there would be a project that people agreed upon. But trying to get them to also say that there'll be 5 more projects like that, because the zoning envelope changed, we sort of deemed it too difficult. I both think that was the right decision at the time. I have moments where I think I kind of regret having made that decision.
So what you're describing is a city is you being kind of the middle person in the negotiation, right, between development and the community.
Yes.
I wonder if the city could take a more proactive approach and inform those communities about the larger kind of picture. This presentation that we saw today, if this, for example, if I may suggest, would be a must to have communities aware of what the city is dealing with, at least as a minimum, before they enter into that process, because you know that these community meetings, people come without knowledge, not informed, and sometimes they are in a position to take decisions, and their voice has more and more weight about big projects. And it's not that these projects would not be approved at some point, but it makes the whole system very cumbersome. And all that translates, as you know, into kind of further problems along the way.
So, Raphael, just to fill out your answer a little bit. So we had been, as a city, development in Detroit doesn't happen without an enormous amount of city, both cash investment and involvement. And so the project we were talking about supporting wasn't really entirely at arm's length away from us. And we weren't behaving it like a middle person. We were like basically a major investor in it. The only other dimension I want to highlight, because I think your point's well taken, is that our efforts to sort of share with people, like this city has to grow, or it's going to be weakened in a way that's much more severe than what we're talking about in Boston. What we encountered was sort of a level of resistance to that was, I think, in some respects, very fair. But to your larger point, I think I would like to say that fighting the longer term battle about getting the ability to do more is what we're going to try to do in Boston, where we say to people, changing this zoning will enable a large amount to happen, and it'll be a one-time sort of higher stakes negotiation or debate, but long term you'll have much more capacity for growth it's less controlled by sort of bodies like the ZBA or others. I do think it's a great question.
Thank you.
You have a question?
Hi, I'm Vivian, a MIT alum. I want to focus on this last slide that you're looking at. I've worked in both state and city government, had worked at the predecessor organization that Arthur heads up. There is not a better time now to go into government, particularly at the local level, than now under Mayor Wu and under Arthur. You will be able to take what you are being trained at MIT and really apply many of the skills, the types of issues that I'm hearing discussed. It is an incredibly, fortunate time for us in this city. We read all the stuff in government, at the federal level and all that, and I encourage you all to vote. But really, in terms of making an impact right now, the stars have aligned. So you've got the head of the government, our mayor, who's not even 40, who cares about the types of issues that we're talking about now. And she has recruited Arthur, who has the skills, who has worked at the federal level, but also in a city like Detroit, which has faced environmental justice issues in such a sensitive way that I would urge you to seriously look at the slide that he's talking about. There is, we talk about the great resignation. Because of the age of a lot of the staff there is a lot of turnover. And so it's really, we couldn't end on a better note than the slide that you see there. So I encourage you to take him up on it, because I think you will find it exhilarating as you continue in your careers. Thanks.
Thank you for those kind words coming from a legend herself.
Thank you. Yes, and I want to just leave the last word to Arthur for any concluding remarks. We're very fortunate to have you speak to us today. So if you want to, I'm guessing you agree with what Vivian just put out there.
I do. It's rare that's something that, again, I think I said this to someone publicly, that if Boston's going to change, I want to be part of that. If Boston doesn't change that much. And there's a lot of embedded skepticism about change. So I've had the pleasure of working in places where situation had gotten to a point where they didn't agree on much, but they did know that something had to change, and they didn't want a bad change to happen, but they knew that. I think there's an active process of persuasion that's going on here, and being part of that and making sure that the change turns out in a good way is what's exciting. So email us. See a hand, there's one last hand if you want to.
Okay, with one more.
Most of my work has been in big cities. I will tell you one of my most rewarding experiences working in the Patrick administration, where I got to work on what we call gateway cities in Massachusetts. So Springfield, Holyoke, Lowell, Lawrence, New Bedford. Very, very fun experience. Very different kind of urbanism, but it's crucial that urbanism be part of what happens there too.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's good. All right.
And please join us again next Monday, but this time online. So we'll be online for the next few sessions before we come back in person again towards the end. Thanks so much.